Life in Bangladesh, one of India's 9 neighbors, has come to a halt. A nation with a population of about 18 crore has seen what started as a student protest escalating into nationwide revolt. As a result, over 200 people died in the last few days. Thousands were injured. A nationwide curfew, shoot at sight orders, internet blackout, snapped mobile services. All of which started in response to a verdict by the country's High Court Division on 5th June 2024. It declared the 2018 government circular that cancelled the 30% quota for freedom fighters' descendants in government jobs as illegal. Things took an ugly turn. Protests picked up momentum as the demand for a rollback of the 30% quota caught pace. This led to sporadic clashes and even deaths. Hasina said, and I quote, if the grandchildren of the freedom fighters don't get quota benefits, should the grandchildren of Razakars get the benefit? The 30% quota in government employment at all levels was being pushed for those who fought for the freedom of Bangladesh from Pakistan, as well as their children and grandchildren. Many foreigners, including over 7,000 Indians, made a quick exit from the country. Evacuations are still on. In a global economy, no nation can live in isolation. A crisis in any nation impacts the globe. India, being one of the closest neighbors to Bangladesh, is bound to see this. Bangladesh is India's biggest trade partner in South Asia, while India is the second biggest trade partner of Bangladesh in Asia. Bangladesh exported $1.97 billion of goods to India in financial year 2024. On Thursday, India secured the operating rights to a terminal in the country's Mongla port, a strategic step forward in strengthening the partnership between the two countries. In this episode, I speak with ET's diplomatic editor, Dipanjan Roy Chaudhary. Dipanjan unravels what led to this chaos and how radical elements are a part of it. I also speak with former Foreign Secretary Harshvardhan Shringla on what lies ahead for Bangladesh and the significance of immediate restoration of peace, not only for the country, but the entire world. It's Friday, July 26. I'm your host, Prachi Verma, and you're listening to this episode on The Morning Brief. My colleague Dipanjan and I speak with Mr. Harsh Shringla, former Foreign Secretary of India, to give us an account about the recent protest uproar in Bangladesh. What is behind the aggression? Why has a simple student protest escalated to violence on the streets?
Well, we've seen a number of days during which the country was virtually locked down. Internet was off. There was a communication blackout. There was curfew. The military was called out. And this was in response to what started as a student protest, but I think later escalated into something which was more political in nature. The opposition, BNP, getting involved, the Jamaat-e-Islami and its youth wing, the Jamaat Shibir, getting involved. We've also now seen a lot of images of arson and violence. Of course, I believe over 100 students and basically civilian casualties have happened. But a lot of government offices, police stations, vehicles, Bangladesh television office have also been burned down. So clearly there's been a level of violence which these demonstrations have spawned also. The genesis of this, of course, is basically a student requirement that the quotas that were introduced for government jobs, in accessing government jobs in 1972, soon after the country became independent, to favor descendants of freedom fighters. That accounts for the largest chunk of 30%. But it's also a reservation for backward districts, 10%, 10% for women, 5% for ethnic minorities, and 1% for the physically challenged. Now, quotas on the whole accounted for some 56% of all jobs, especially the higher level jobs reserved in government. And the students felt that after 50 odd years since the independence of the country, there should be a more level playing field, and these quotas needed to give way. And I think 5 years or so ago, and I recall because I was there that time, government had agreed to the demands of the students that quotas would be withdrawn. And that is what happened. But more recently, the issue was challenged in the High Court. And the High Court stayed that government decision. And government then appealed the High Court order in the Supreme Court, which means the government was in favor of what the students have been saying. And the Supreme Court verdict was out. So when Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina actually addressed the countrymen on this issue, she said that we are with you and we agree that there should be an abolition of quota. But this is a matter which is with the courts, it's not with us. And we will try and get the courts to take a decision on it as soon as possible.
The situation has been calm for the last couple of days. Internet services have been restored. Bangladesh student group leader has even suspended protests for 48 hours. But the water is still not under the bridge. So I asked Mr. Shringla about the chances of the protests getting flared up again.
There are some underlying factors, and those factors may precipitate, recurrence of agitations and demonstrations and basically violence. I mean, we have to understand that such violence and such level of arson and general strikes and protests have been a part of the normal political life in Bangladesh. These things occurred very frequently prior to 2010, I would say, before Sheikh Hasina came back to power in that period of time. The fact that we are seeing more of this is obviously of some concern. But over the last 15 years or so, we haven't seen too much of this. And there's been a certain level of stability, political and economic stability, that has enabled the country to grow at a very fast rate. But today we are seeing, certain economic factors that are in some senses new to this level of growth. Essentially, COVID-19 has been quite devastating for the economy. You've seen high price rises, inflation. You've seen also shortages of certain commodities because of the foreign exchange issue. So all of this, I think, has impacted on people. Clearly, jobs are an issue because the economy is not doing so well. Private sector growth has been affected. And so I think basically the youth is the manifestation of the concerns in society. People are saying that, the expectation that they had in terms of growth and development and their own aspirations haven't been fully met in the last couple of years. And this, I think, is possible underlying factors. But we have to see how, as I said, the situation evolves as we go along.
The larger problem of economic discontent could be the root cause of these protests. But what would help the Bangladesh government from stopping the occurrence of another one? Here is Dipanjan elaborating on the same.
When jobs are not growing, so therefore the students feel, and these are for primarily students in the government colleges in Bangladesh, government universities. The private university students, many of them, I think they get scholarships or they go study abroad. Bangladesh has a system of dual citizenship. And so they are all, they were not really concerned about government jobs, but there is a section which is concerned about the government jobs because there is no other job creation. The private sector is creating certain jobs in Bangladesh. The NGO sector has created jobs in Bangladesh. I think the academy has created jobs in Bangladesh. But then, the population is increasing. It's not a stagnant population, There are more youth. And I think that the answer to that is, as I mentioned, are structural changes in the economy, which create more jobs, which create, for example, in India, the startup ecosystem which has been created. I think the consumerism is high in Bangladesh. The spending of a common family is actually higher than many parts of the world in Bangladesh. They're generally entrepreneurial type people. They would like to have a good lifestyle. So they would, at the consumerism, they would not mind spending, So I think that there is a scope for, in a country with decent level of education, the need for certain startup ecosystem, which also absorb some youth. So the government of the day and has really addressed those issues. The economic crisis that has been perpetuated first by COVID and then by the Ukraine conflict, and they could not manage to probably get oil at discount, fertilizer at discount. I think they got scared by sanctions, and so they have to find their way out in terms of addressing it. Else, this movement would come back in some form or the other.
Bangladesh has had a history of disruptive protests for the longest time now. But as Mr. Shringla mentioned, the country has also been in an upward motion for the last 15 years. So what made this protest so big and loud? What role did radical elements play in instigating the events in the past few days? I ask him.
Those who are opposed, to the current government, and essentially the BNP and the Jamaat-e-Islami are very well organized outside the country. They have lobbying groups. They have very systematic methods of accessing leadership in various countries to put their point of view across. And one of the ways that they tend to influence opinion also both in the countries they're in and within Bangladesh is through social media. Now, we've noticed a very large number of people commenting with a certain slant, all of whom are so-called activists, people in exile, etc., in various countries around the world. So we don't see too much from the country. Of course, there was a internet, cut off, but most of the people who are active are those outside the country. And very large number of fake accounts, misinformation, disinformation, bots that are in operation. And that, I think, is an effort to try and mobilize opinion. So one of the reasons government, I think, is cut off internet. And of course, the government maintains that because the Bangladesh telecommunications building was torched and the fiber optic cables were burned down, that led to the shutdown of the internet. But here, the important thing is the ability to mobilize public opinion in a particular direction, to incite violence, incite arson, incite people in a manner that is not factually correct, I think was the concern. The government was, from what I can see, Bangladesh government was concerned that a lot of misinformation was going around, and that could lead to inflaming passions on a completely factually incorrect basis. So there is a certain point here that in today's context, governments are always conscious of both the positive and the negative uses of the internet and the social media. And of course, when it is not in the public interest, then you have to take steps that are necessary.
Chances of the radical elements stopping just at these protests are unlikely. Are they likely to make efforts for escalation in other forms?
They will certainly use any situation to their advantage. If there's any factor that they can use to agitate people, bring them out of the streets, and then take subterfuge behind them to, indulge in violence and arson, they will do that. That's been their modus operandi. I think it is in the Bangladeshi government's interest to give them minimum reason to capitalize on this. But peace and stability is a very vital factor. I mean, a peaceful, stable Bangladesh is inherent interest because the situation otherwise could lead to, this basically radical influences coming across the border, affecting populations within India. Bangladesh could revert back to what it was during the BNP's time. And I think given the fact that Bangladesh has a population of 160, 170 million people, the impact on the entire region and the world could be a very significant if Bangladesh as a country goes out of control. So it's in our interest to keep it peaceful and stable, work with the Bangladesh authorities to provide any assistance needed in stabilizing the situation, having all the factors that can continue to secure the country economically and otherwise. And I think this is an endeavor which we have to do, not just for the sake of Bangladesh, but for our own sake as well.
Any unrest of this scale in a nation is bound to hit border economies. In this scenario, the question arises, what is the impact on the trade between Bangladesh and India?
Normally, the border points, the land points which have integrated checkposts or customs posts deal with a fair amount of cross-border trade. There's a lot of traffic between the two countries and exchanges in goods. During this period, I'm told that it's really slowed down to a trickle. And obviously with the curfew, there's been virtually no movement. If the movement were to continue, and if this sort of protests, etc., and violence, etc., would continue over a period of time, I think the longer it continues, the more it'll impact on Bangladesh's economy in an adverse way, and of course on the trade between India and Bangladesh, which has grown very significantly and accelerated very fast. Today, Bangladesh is our fifth largest trading partner in the world. 10 years ago, it was not even on that list of major trading partners. I think both countries have worked to facilitate trade, to remove barriers to trade, to provide infrastructure that can be conducive to more trade and investments, and especially at the border points. I think the border integrated checkposts, the road systems, the entire infrastructure has been upgraded significantly. The railway system and the re-establishment of at least 6 or 7 connectivity lines by rail, the expansion of port facilities in Chittagong, Mongla, etc., which India had invested heavily in through our lines of credit, I think have definitely facilitated much more active sort of trade between our two countries. And today, trade is close to $20 billion. And I think that trade is very important for Bangladesh and to some extent for us as well, especially for our neighboring states, West Bengal, Assam, Tripura, Meghalaya.
With India sharing a long border with Bangladesh, I tried to get a status check on Indians in Bangladesh from Dipanjan.
I think the flights are operating. Some flights are operating, some are not operating. So a lot of students have come back. I think out of 15,000 Indian nationals who are there have been 8,500 students. Over, I would now say that 5,000 students have come back. Indian consulates have helped students from Nepal, Bhutan, Maldives to also come back. There's another, who are the rest of the Indians? See, these Indians who are in Bangladesh are working on projects, Some of them are working for multinational companies, some of them working for UN. So Bangladesh in that way is also providing, there is an Indian diaspora, which may be very small compared to many other countries. I think many of those Indians who are professionals have stayed back. The students, of course, because they are in hostels and because this was a student movement, and they could have got impacted. The rest, many of them are in a different, secured zone or secured societies, may not be directly physically harmed, actually. So I think that as the situation normalizes, the panic should also come down.
Have the current affairs in Bangladesh been mishandled by the government? Could this have been salvaged? I ask.
Would not say that because, we also had, following our, independence struggle, we also had, privileges and facilities for our freedom fighters. And I think that continued for some time. And Bangladesh is no different. They've also had to compensate those people who fought for the independence of their country. And so I think they were justified in 1972 in having this a certain amount of compensation for those who lost their lives, livelihoods, relatives and so on and so forth. And then that went on. So obviously government today recognizes that after 50 odd years, there is no more basis to continue with this. And that is why they've done away with it. But the students were not asking for a blanket removal of quotas. They understood that you needed quotas for certain categories, ethnic minorities, physically challenged, etc. I think they were basically more interested in the removal of that 30%. But I believe except for 2%, the courts have moved all quotas. So instead of 56%, 54% quotas have been removed and 2% quotas that have remained. 2% is for all the other, basically women, backward districts, ethnic minorities, physically challenged.
Women reservation has really worked. That's the backbone of our constituency, and the two immediate surviving family members of Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman are. So I don't think that really has any impact on, Bangladesh Parliament also has this 30% extra seats for women, many women MPs, leading personalities of the Bangladesh society, business. Bengali society is much different, where the women are at the forefront of social movement, of political movement, of, economic emancipation. And she's empowered the women, and the women actually are holding key posts. And that reservation really hasn't That's not the reason for this kind of an outcry. I mean, this has a completely different. This is a more economic crisis than. I mean, reservation is just the tip of the iceberg. Yeah.
So, what exactly does the government need to do to shore up the economy of the country further?
One thing, is there, in the last few years, Bangladesh has also put in place a certain economic measure, certain infrastructure, which is, the metro rail has been started. There are major, one which is the Padma Bridge, actually. It is a marvel of an architecture, which was impossible, in the history. Nobody thought it could be done. But it has led to businesses, but it has not led to job creation. I think there is also a disenchantment with corruption of a section of the Bangladesh elites, and that need to be addressed. I think these are being exploited by forces inimical to Bangladesh. So, the issue of corruption, which has, in a certain section of elites, that need to be addressed at the earliest. So the economy has to be fixed in a more formal way. And because there are a lot of informal sectors in the ways the Bangladesh economy run, that has to be formalized. I mean, there are plans, actually. She has to fast track all these so that the opposition is not trying to grab power through street violence.
Introducing job reservations have always been tricky. There is a history of almost all job quota announcements running into controversies. Let's take the case back home. States like Haryana, Andhra Pradesh, Jharkhand, and most recently Karnataka have all made attempts on this front. The demand for job quota here is for the locals. But all such announcements were soon followed by unrest. Protests on job quota in Bangladesh were no different to begin with, until it reached a different level altogether. No comparison, considering the loss of so many lives. The public angst stemming from economic discontent and political system failures found its way through violence. Anyone, and not just the students, vented out their political and economic grievances under the garb of quota protests. For now, as we record this episode, broadband internet services are restored in selected areas. Mobile internet services are yet to be restored. The government here has issued a Gazette notification in line with the verdict of the Bangladesh Supreme Court. Arrests of close to 2,000 people have been made over the last few days in connection with the recent violence. Efforts are on to restore peace and normalcy at the earliest. Pray that things get back on track soon. That's all for today. I'm your host Prachi Verma, and you were listening to the Morning Brief from the Economic Times. This episode was produced by Surohini Jain, sound editor Indranil Bhattacharya, executive producers Anirban Chaudhary and Arijit Burman. The Morning Brief drops every Tuesday, Thursday and Friday. Do tune in to ET Play for all audio content, including the Morning Brief. You can listen to our podcast on all major podcast streaming platforms. Thank you for listening and have a nice day ahead. All external sound clips used in this episode belong to the respective owners. Credits are mentioned in the description.